The conveyor belt hummed its mechanical lullaby while I stood clutching a boarding pass that someone else had printed for me. Around us, Terminal C buzzed with the eternal choreography of goodbyes, families embracing with the desperation of wartime farewells, lovers stealing final kisses that tasted of coffee and promises, children clinging to grandparents' wool coat sleeves as if physical contact could stop time itself. But my son simply waved from beyond the security checkpoint, a quick dismissive gesture that might have been shooing away a persistent pigeon that had wandered too close to outdoor dining. "Mom, you're good from here, right?" His voice carried that particular tone I'd grown to recognize over the past 3 years, the one that transformed statements into questions while expecting no actual response beyond compliance. "We've got the car in short-term parking, and Sarah needs to get back for Lily's soccer practice. You know how she gets when we're late to anything." I nodded because that's what I did. What I'd always done. The same automatic response I'd offered when he moved back into my house with his wife and 8-year-old daughter, promising it would be temporary while they figured things out financially. The same agreeable nod I'd given when my weekly grocery allowance became contingent on what they called good behavior, which mostly meant staying quiet about bills that arrived in my name but somehow never reached my hands for actual review. Sarah didn't even glance up from her phone screen. Her thumbs moved with the practiced efficiency of a court stenographer across the glass surface, probably updating her social media followers about the tedious inconvenience of airport drop-offs and family obligations that interfered with more important activities. The notification chime sounded sharp in the ambient airport noise, and I watched her fingers fly across the keyboard with the urgency of someone managing far more pressing matters than elderly relatives who required transportation assistance. Then my own phone buzzed against my hip. A text message materialized on the screen with the cold efficiency of an automated billing system: "Airport trip, $127 gas, $73 parking. Please Venmo by tomorrow. Thanks." Smiling face with smiling eyes. $200 for the privilege of being driven to catch a flight I'd saved 8 months to afford, counting grocery money and skipping restaurant meals and walking to the library instead of taking the bus to accumulate enough for this one small adventure. I stared at the message, then at my son's retreating figure growing smaller through the security checkpoint crowd, then down at the boarding pass trembling slightly between my fingers like a leaf that wasn't sure which way the wind was blowing. The terminal continued its endless dance of arrivals and departures around me, but I stood perfectly still in the current of it all, an island of sudden clarity in the sea of purposeful movement. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched toward the October sky, rain pressed against the glass with autumn insistence. Each droplet caught the harsh fluorescent light like tiny prisms, splitting ordinary illumination into small rainbows that lasted only seconds before sliding down toward invisible destinations. The PA system crackled to life above my head. "Flight 847 to Portland now boarding Zone 1 passengers at Gate C7. My flight. My gate. My seat assignment that I could recite from memory, 14F, window, exactly where I'd requested when I'd made the reservation 6 weeks ago with the careful deliberation of someone who hadn't made independent travel plans in over a decade. But instead of moving toward the gate, I found myself studying the faces around me. A young mother is juggling a squirming toddler while checking her boarding pass for the 3rd time. An elderly man in a veteran's cap is moving slowly but determinedly toward his departure gate, his dignity intact despite requiring a walking cane. Teenagers clustered around charging stations, their easy confidence in navigating the world making me remember what that felt like. Dignity makes no scene, it simply stands still. The words formed in my mind as if someone had whispered them directly into my ear. Not born from anger or hurt, but from a strange, crystalline moment of clarity that tasted like cold metal and long overdue truth. The kind of realization that arrives not with fanfare but with the quiet certainty of recognizing something you've always known but temporarily forgotten. I wouldn't board that plane. Not today. Not like this. Not as someone who required management and supervision and payment reminders for basic human kindness. Instead, I turned away from Gate C7 and walked back toward the parking garage, my wheeled suitcase clicking against the wet pavement in a rhythm that somehow matched my suddenly steady heartbeat. The rain kept falling, and with each step away from that gate, I felt something fundamental shifting inside my chest, a loosening, like a knot that had finally remembered how to untie itself after years of patient waiting. People passed me heading in the opposite direction, toward their gates and their scheduled departures, and I wondered how many of them were traveling because they wanted to versus how many were traveling because someone else had decided they should. How many boarding passes were printed by other hands? How many itineraries reflected other people's ideas about what constituted appropriate adventure? The parking garage smelled like concrete and gasoline, and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces where hundreds of cars waited for their owners to return from whatever journeys had temporarily separated them. I stood there for a moment, key fob in hand, trying to remember the last time I'd driven anywhere without asking permission or justifying my destination to someone who might have opinions about whether my errand was necessary. Chapter 2. In 7 days, everything with my name changed. 7 days. That's how long it would take to unravel 3 years of carefully constructed dependence and rebuild something that looked like autonomy. 7 days to transform from someone who asked permission to exist in her own life into someone who simply existed, without apology or explanation. But I could see it all already, playing out in my mind like a movie I was finally ready to direct instead of simply watching. The bank forms bearing fresh signatures, written in my own handwriting without anyone standing over my shoulder offering helpful suggestions about financial responsibility. New keys sliding into familiar locks with the authority of ownership rather than the hesitation of someone borrowing space in her own home. Different tickets emerging from my own printer, purchased with my own decisions, scheduled according to no one's calendar but mine, destinations chosen because they called to something inside me that had been quiet too long. The marigold tea I would brew on that first morning of my reclaimed life would taste sharper somehow, more deliberate, as if the very act of choosing my own departure dates and banking arrangements had seasoned it with something I'd forgotten existed, the particular flavor of my own authority, aged like good wine in the cellar of postponed dreams. I would learn to measure freedom in signatures rather than shouts, in the quiet revolution of changed passwords and revised beneficiaries. In the soft click of mouse buttons, selecting confirm purchase for things I wanted rather than things other people thought I should want. In the satisfying weight of car keys that belonged to me and responded to my decisions about where we would go together. I measured freedom in signatures, not shouts. Bank statements would arrive with only my name in the address window. Credit card bills would reflect purchases I had made, places I had chosen to spend money, subscriptions to services I actually wanted, rather than auto-renewals for things other people thought would be good for me. The savings account my father had hidden in the margins of my favorite book would fund adventures I planned in the quiet hours of early morning, over coffee that stayed warm because no one was rushing me to finish and move on to more important activities. Train tickets to coastal towns where I could walk on beaches without explaining to anyone why I wanted to feel sand between my toes. Museum memberships that would let me spend entire afternoons studying paintings that spoke to parts of me that had been sleeping. Small hotel rooms with ocean views that belonged entirely to me for the duration of my stay. Room service menus I could explore without worrying about the cost or whether someone else might disapprove of ordering dessert for breakfast. Balconies where I could sit with morning coffee and afternoon tea and evening wine if I felt like it, watching sunsets that followed no schedule but their own ancient rhythm. Chapter 3. Receipts and Reverberations. The conversation that would later catalyze everything began 3 nights before my non-departure, over dinner rolls I had baked that afternoon while Sarah reorganized my spice cabinet according to some system I wasn't consulted about. The pot roast was fork tender, seasoned the way my son had liked it since childhood, but he cut through it with unnecessary precision as he delivered the neighbor's latest observations about my supposedly declining capabilities. Mrs. Peterson mentioned she saw you asking the bus driver for directions last week, he said, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth as if the weight of neighborhood concern might affect his appetite. She was worried about your ability to manage things independently anymore. I set down my own fork and studied his face across my dining room table, searching for traces of the boy who used to build elaborate blanket forts in my living room and declare them sovereign nations with their own constitutions and currencies made from construction paper. When had his features become so sharp around the edges? When had his mouth learned to curve in that particular way when discussing my supposed limitations? I was asking about the express route downtown, I replied quietly, my voice steady despite the way my pulse had started keeping irregular time. I wanted to visit the main library's genealogy research section. Mom. Sarah's voice carried that patient tone typically reserved for explaining obvious concepts to slow children or elderly relatives who couldn't be expected to understand modern realities. There's a perfectly adequate library branch 6 blocks from here. You don't need to go traipsing all over the city when there are perfectly good resources right in the neighborhood. Traipsing. As if my 72-year-old legs were some sort of public menace, wandering beyond their designated boundaries without proper supervision and geographical restrictions. Besides, my son added, reaching for his water glass with the deliberate care of someone making an important point, it's not safe for you to be riding public transportation alone. What if something happened? What if you got confused about which stop was yours? I had been riding city buses for over 50 years. I had navigated the subway systems of New York and Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, had taken trains across 3 European countries during my honeymoon, when my late husband was still alive to share adventures with me. But somehow, in the past 3 years, my navigation skills had been downgraded to those of a confused tourist who couldn't be trusted to read basic transit maps. The conversation continued around me while I found myself studying the grain of my dining room table instead. The same table where I'd helped my son with algebra homework and taught him to balance his first checkbook and celebrated his college acceptance letter. They would remember those moments even if the people sitting around it seemed to have forgotten the competence that had carried us through all those earlier years. The Hendersons were saying their mother had to go into assisted living after she started getting confused about money, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the earnest tone of someone sharing important information for everyone's benefit. It started with little things, forgetting to pay bills, getting mixed up about bank balances. They said they wished they'd intervened sooner. Intervened. As if independent living was a problem requiring outside solutions rather than a right that came with being a functional adult who paid her own bills and maintained her own household. I'm not confused about money, I said, but my voice sounded smaller than I intended, as if the words themselves weren't sure they deserved to be heard. Of course not, Mom. But you have to admit, it would be easier if you didn't have to worry about all those details. That's what family is for, to help shoulder the burdens so you can just enjoy your retirement. Enjoy my retirement. As if the past 3 years of having my grocery lists reviewed and my banking decisions questioned and my social activities monitored had been some sort of vacation from the responsibilities of adult life. Later that night, after they'd retreated to what used to be my sewing room, the space where I'd once created quilts and mended clothes and planned projects that belonged entirely to me, I sat alone at my kitchen table with chamomile tea and the passbook I kept hidden behind my collection of recipe cards that no one had touched since my daughter-in-law decided my cooking was too heavy for modern dietary sensibilities. The small blue booklet felt foreign in my hands, as if I'd forgotten the basic mechanics of financial self-monitoring. When had I stopped balancing my own checkbook? When had automatic payments replaced my careful monthly ritual of sitting down with bills and stamps and the satisfaction of managing my obligations myself? The numbers told a story I'd been avoiding for months. Automatic transfers that moved money from my accounts to pay for household expenses I'd never agreed to cover. Bill payments for services I'd never requested, premium cable packages, landscaping services, and subscription boxes full of organic snacks that arrived monthly, whether anyone wanted them or not. My checking account balance never seemed to align with my mental arithmetic anymore, but I'd attributed the discrepancy to the natural confusion of aging rather than the systematic redirection of my financial autonomy into other people's management systems. The old fountain pen I discovered in my kitchen junk drawer felt foreign between my fingers, as if I'd forgotten how to hold an instrument of my own agency. But I wrote anyway, slowly and deliberately, my handwriting shakier than I remembered but still legible, questions for the bank. Below that heading, a list that grew longer with each contemplative sip of tea. Account access protocols and current authorization signatures. Power of attorney status and scope of permissions granted. personal credit report and current score, safe deposit box inventory and access rights, automatic payment arrangements and beneficiary designations, monthly statement delivery and account review procedures. Silence doesn't mean consent, it means counting. And I had some serious counting to do. Chapter 4, Under the Ceiling Fan at the Bank. The next morning arrived gray and steady, October weather that made bus windows fog with condensed breath and private thoughts that passengers carried with them toward unknown destinations. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing each item like armor for a battle I wasn't sure how to fight, but knew I couldn't avoid any longer. The navy cardigan that made me feel competent, its wool soft with age, but still holding its shape. The low-heeled shoes moved quietly across marble floors without announcing their owner's presence to everyone within hearing distance. A silk scarf my late husband had brought me from a business trip to Chicago, back when my wardrobe reflected my own choices rather than other people's opinions about what was appropriate for my age and circumstances. The passbook went into my purse alongside 2 forms of identification and the small notebook where I'd transcribed my questions in careful block letters that would be legible even if my nerves made my handwriting less steady than usual. The bus driver smiled when I climbed aboard, the same cheerful man who'd provided directions to the library research wing the previous week and who treated every passenger with the same courteous dignity regardless of their age or apparent purpose. "Morning, miss. Heading downtown again today?" "Miss." When was the last time anyone had addressed me with that simple respect, that assumption of capability and independence that came with being treated as a person rather than a problem requiring management? "The financial district," I replied, dropping exact change into the fare box with more satisfaction than the simple transaction warranted. "I have some business matters to attend to." The bank stood solid and institutional on the corner of 5th and Market, its brass nameplate weathered but dignified, like a well-maintained monument to the serious business of money and trust and the relationships that develop between people and their financial security. Inside, ceiling fans turned lazily above clusters of desks where younger people in crisp shirts discussed mortgages and investment strategies with the confidence of those who'd never had their mental competence questioned by their own children. The lobby smelled like leather and fresh flowers, and the particular mixture of cleaning products and money that marked it as a place where important decisions were made by people who understood the difference between guidance and control. I approached the information counter with my shoulders straight and my prepared questions ready for deployment, feeling like a diplomat entering foreign territory where I wasn't sure of the customs but knew the importance of my mission. "Good morning. I'd like to review my complete account activity," I informed the young man behind the polished counter, his name tag reading Marcus in professional serif font. "All transactions, going back 2 full years." He glanced at his computer screen, then at me, then back at the screen with the expression of someone recalibrating his initial assumptions about my banking needs and sophistication. "Ma'am, we can certainly print basic statements for you, but for comprehensive transaction research and analysis, you'll want to speak with one of our customer service representatives." "May I ask what specifically you're hoping to review?" "Unauthorized transactions," I said, meeting his eyes with steady directness that seemed to surprise both of us. "And I'd like to understand the current power of attorney arrangements affecting my accounts." The word unauthorized changed everything about his posture and attention level. Within 10 minutes, I was seated across from Mrs. Chen, a sub-manager with intelligent eyes and the sort of careful competence that develops from years of helping people navigate the intersection of family relationships and financial dignity. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, spreading my account history across her desk like a detailed map of territory I'd forgotten I owned. "I can see there have been some significant structural changes to your accounts in recent months. Are these modifications you personally initiated and authorized?" The ceiling fan above us maintained its steady rhythm while I studied the papers spread before me. Transfer authorizations bearing signatures that resembled mine but felt foreign, like handwriting samples from someone who shared my name but not my decision-making process. Bill payment arrangements I'd never discussed with anyone, automatic withdrawals for services I'd never requested or approved. And there, clipped to the back of the stack, a power of attorney document that granted my son comprehensive access to accounts I'd nearly forgotten existed, a savings account my late husband had opened for emergency purposes, a small investment portfolio that had been quietly growing for 15 years, a credit line I'd never used but which apparently someone else had found useful. "No," I said, and the word felt solid and true in my mouth, like the first honest thing I'd said about my financial situation in months. "These are not changes I initiated or authorized." Mrs. Chen's pen moved across fresh forms with quick, professional strokes. Account freezes pending investigation. Signature verification requests. Power of attorney revocation paperwork that would require notarization and 7 business days to process completely through their legal department. "I want to be absolutely clear about the implications of these changes," she said, looking up from her careful documentation. "Once we revoke the existing power of attorney and restore your exclusive account control, all automatic transfers will cease immediately. Bill payment arrangements will revert to manual approval, requiring your personal authorization. Your son will no longer have any access to conduct transactions on your behalf." "And if he objects to these changes?" "He's certainly entitled to voice his concerns, but the law is quite clear on this matter. You're the primary account holder, and as long as you demonstrate mental competency, which our interaction today certainly confirms, you have the absolute right to control your own financial affairs. Paper can tremble, but hands can stay steady." I thought about the expression on my son's face when he'd mentioned my supposed dependence and the neighbors' concerns about my ability to manage independently. About Sarah's fingers flying across her phone screen during dinner, managing everyone's schedules and obligations except her own, and showing courtesy toward the people who provided her housing. About the text message demanding immediate reimbursement for the privilege of being driven to an airport I'd ultimately chosen not to enter. "I understand completely," I said, and signed my name with deliberate care. The ink flowed dark and certain across the official forms, each letter a small but significant declaration of renewed independence. My signature looked like itself again, confident, clear, belonging to someone who had the right to make decisions about her own life. Mrs. Chen handed me copies of everything, explaining the timeline for processing and the new procedures for accessing my accounts. She also provided her direct phone number and assured me that any future concerns or questions would be handled personally rather than through the general customer service department. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mrs. Harrison?" I thought about that question as I gathered my papers and prepared to leave. Was there anything else? After 3 years of having other people answer that question for me, it felt revolutionary to be asked directly what I might need or want. "Yes," I said finally. "I'd like to add a note to my account that any future power of attorney requests require my physical presence and a 30-day waiting period before implementation." She made a note in my file. "Excellent idea. That will ensure you have time to consider any arrangements carefully before they take effect." Walking home from the bank, I felt the metaphorical weight of new keys in my purse, not physical keys yet, but the conceptual ones that would unlock accounts and restore access to the management of my own life. The afternoon air felt different somehow, less heavy with the obligation to justify my existence to people who'd forgotten that I'd managed perfectly well for 70 years before they decided I needed their help. Chapter 5, Locks Remember Better Than People. The locksmith's shop on Elm Street had been there for as long as I could remember, with its hand-painted sign that read "Locks Remember Better Than People" in faded blue letters that someone touched up every few years but never completely repainted. I'd always assumed it was just a clever business slogan, but standing at the storefront window studying the display of brass deadbolts and security chains, I began to understand it as something closer to philosophy. Locks remember what they're supposed to protect. They remember which keys belong and which don't. They remember their purpose without getting confused by emotional manipulation, family obligations, or the convenient assumption that good intentions justify unlimited access. The owner looked up from his workbench when I entered, his hands bearing the honest stains of his trade, metal oil and brass polish and the accumulated patina of working with mechanisms designed to keep important things safe from people who might not have earned the right to access them. "Something I can help you with today?" "I need my locks changed," I said without hesitation, surprised by how clear my voice sounded. "All of them. Today, if possible." He set down his tools and studied my face with the careful attention of someone who understood that locks represented far more than keeping valuables secure from strangers. His expression suggested he'd had this conversation before, with other people who'd discovered that sometimes the greatest threats to our security come from those who believe their good intentions grant them unlimited access to our private spaces. House keys? Vehicle? What are we talking about here? Home. Front door, back door, and the side gate that leads to my garden. I paused, thinking of my son's keychain, heavy with copies of keys to places he visited when I wasn't there to grant permission or supervise his activities. I want locks that remember only what I specifically tell them to remember. His smile suggested approval rather than curiosity about my motivations. I can do that. How soon do you need this completed? Today, if possible. I'll pay whatever emergency service fees are necessary. No emergency fees needed. Just a woman who's decided to change what her locks remember. I respect that. He pulled out a scheduling book that looked like it predated computer systems by several decades. I can be there in 2 hours. Will that work for your timeline? An hour and a half later, he followed me home in his van marked with the same philosophy painted on both sides: locks remember better than people. His tool belt jangled with the musical sound of small metal instruments as we walked up my front steps together, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd invited someone into my home who was there to help me rather than to evaluate my competence or offer unsolicited advice about my life choices. We worked mostly in comfortable silence, the old locks surrendering to his practiced hands with soft clicks and metallic sighs that sounded like small mechanical surrenders. Each lock that came free felt like shedding a layer of obligation I hadn't realized I was carrying. These were good locks, he said, examining the hardware he'd removed. Well maintained, properly installed. Nothing wrong with them except they remembered the wrong people. When he handed me the new keys, bright brass catching the afternoon light streaming through my front windows, they felt warm and foreign and entirely mine. Each key was perfectly cut, with no rough edges or imperfections that might catch in the mechanism or require the sort of practiced jiggling that develops over time between familiar locks and their authorized users. You'll want to test them several times, he advised, packing his tools with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times for people in similar circumstances. Make sure they turn smoothly and easily. Sometimes new locks feel a little stiff until they get properly acquainted with their owner. I tested each lock 3 times, feeling the smooth turn of keys that belonged only to me and responded only to my decision about when they should open. The front door, the back door, and the side gate that led to my small garden, where I grew marigolds, herbs, and vegetables that no one else had opinions about. That should do it, he said, loading the old locks into his van. These new ones will remember exactly what you tell them to remember, nothing more and nothing less. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table with marigold tea and my new keys arranged before me like small golden promises of security and autonomy. The house felt different somehow, quieter but not empty, secure but not sealed off from possibility. For the first time in months, I could hear my own thoughts clearly over the constant background noise of other people's expectations and management strategies. The afternoon light slanted through my windows at the perfect angle to illuminate the small things I'd stopped noticing, the way dust motes danced in sunbeams, the particular pattern of shadows cast by my grandmother's lace curtains, the soft ticking of the clock my late husband had wound faithfully every Sunday morning for 37 years. Boundaries are love spelled with steadiness. Chapter 6, Their anger arrived before their visit. The telephone rang just as I was settling into this new quality of silence, its sharp tone cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like an alarm designed to summon me back to my designated role as someone who required management and supervision. Mom? My son's voice carried an edge I hadn't heard since his teenage years, when reasonable parental requests were met with unreasonable resistance and dramatic declarations of independence. I tried to stop by after work, but my key doesn't seem to fit properly. Did you have some kind of problem with the locks? No problem at all, I said, stirring honey into my tea with deliberate calm. I had them changed this afternoon. The pause stretched long enough for me to hear Sarah's voice in the background, sharp and urgent with the particular tone that meant someone was about to be blamed for creating unnecessary complications in her carefully managed schedule. Then my son again, struggling to maintain his reasonable tone while processing information that didn't fit his understanding of our family hierarchy. Why would you do something like that without discussing it with us first? We live there too, you know. We need access for emergencies. You live in my house, I corrected gently, testing how the words felt in my mouth. There's an important difference between living somewhere and owning the space where you live. Mom, this is... He stopped, regrouped, and started again with the forced patience of someone explaining obvious realities to a confused person. This is concerning behavior. First, the bank calls about some paperwork complications. Now you're changing locks without any warning or family consultation. Sarah thinks maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Morrison, just to make sure you're thinking clearly about these major decisions. I watched steam rise from my teacup and thought about the young man at the bank who'd said unauthorized transactions as if the words themselves carried legal weight and serious consequences. About Mrs. Chen's careful explanation of mental competency standards and legal rights that belong to account holders regardless of their family members' opinions. About the locksmith who understood that sometimes people need their spaces to remember different things. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said, and meant it completely. Perhaps that's what's concerning about it. Their anger arrived before their visit, announced by car doors slamming harder than necessary in my driveway and the sharp staccato of heels on my front walkway that suggested someone was preparing for confrontation rather than conversation. Sarah's finger jabbed at my doorbell as if the button had personally offended her sense of family hierarchy and proper consultation protocols. When I opened the door, they stood on my porch like an official delegation from the Department of Reasonable Expectations, faces arranged in the sort of expressions typically reserved for staging interventions and competency hearings and other gatherings where one person's autonomy gets discussed by everyone except that person. We need to talk, my son announced, not quite meeting my eyes but speaking with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed without question. I stepped aside to let them enter, noting how they moved through my space with the presumptuous familiarity of landlords conducting property inspections. Sarah went directly to the kitchen island, where she usually spread her real estate brochures and household management paperwork, transforming my space into her temporary office without asking permission or acknowledging that she was a guest in someone else's home. Today, however, she carried only a manila folder and the sort of righteous indignation that develops when convenient arrangements are suddenly disrupted by the inconvenient autonomy of people who are supposed to remain manageable. Would you like tea? I offered, filling the kettle despite their obvious impatience with social niceties and proper hospitality rituals. Mom, we're not here for a social visit. My son settled himself at my dining room table with the authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention during important family discussions. We're here because you've been making some very concerning decisions lately. The bank situation, the lock changes, this whole paranoid episode about your financial management. Paranoid. The word hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette someone had forgotten to extinguish properly, filling the space with the acrid scent of accusation and implied mental instability. Sarah's been doing research, he continued, sliding the manila folder across the table toward me with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting crucial evidence. About elder care resources, competency evaluation procedures, protective services for seniors who might be struggling with sound decision-making. I let the kettle whistle while I absorbed the full implications of protective services and competency evaluations and the careful legal language that transforms autonomy into pathology when it becomes inconvenient for other people's plans and expectations. I see, I said finally, turning off the burner and pouring water over tea bags that released the earthy scent of chamomile into the rising steam. And what specifically suggests that I'm struggling with decision-making? Sarah leaned forward, her voice taking on the patient cadence of someone explaining obvious realities to a confused person who couldn't be expected to understand the larger picture without assistance. Changing your financial arrangements without family consultation. Locking your own family out of your home without warning or discussion. Canceling a trip you'd been planning and saving for months without any reasonable explanation for the sudden change of heart. I didn't cancel the trip, I said quietly, setting 3 cups on the table, though I suspected only mine would actually be touched. I simply chose not to board the plane. Which is essentially the same thing. Sarah's voice rose slightly, her professional composure slipping to reveal the frustration underneath. I poured tea with steady hands, watching the liquid flow golden and steaming into cups that belonged to me, in a kitchen that belonged to me, during a conversation that was happening in my house according to my decision to allow it. Canceling would have involved asking permission to change my mind. What I did was exercise my right to change my mind. My son rubbed his temples as if I were giving him a headache through sheer obstinacy and deliberate misunderstanding of reasonable family concerns. Mom, you're not making sense. You saved money for 8 months for that trip. You talked about it constantly during dinner. Then you just walk away from the airport and decide to turn our entire family's financial stability upside down instead? Our family's financial stability? I repeated the phrase carefully, tasting its implications like wine that might have turned bitter while stored in conditions that weren't properly controlled. You mean your access to my accounts? I mean the responsible management of shared household expenses and family resources, Sarah interjected, pulling crisp papers from her folder with efficient movements that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation. Which brings us to this. She slid a document across the table toward me with the flourish of someone presenting a generous gift that would solve everyone's problems if only I could be reasonable enough to accept it gracefully. Fresh power of attorney paperwork, professionally prepared and notarized, with signature lines highlighted in bright yellow marker for my convenience. The legal language was dense but clear, comprehensive authority over financial decisions, medical choices, property management, and social arrangements deemed necessary for my well-being and protection. We've had this drawn up by a qualified attorney, Sarah continued with the tone of someone presenting the obvious solution to a problem everyone else could see clearly. It's more comprehensive than the previous arrangement, with clearer guidelines about financial oversight and medical decision-making authority. For your own protection, of course. I stared at the papers, at the careful legal language that would transform my remaining autonomy into their expanded authority, gift-wrapped in concern for my welfare and protection from the apparently dangerous consequences of managing my own life. And if I choose not to sign this document? My son's face shifted into the expression he'd worn as a child when denied something he considered his natural right, a mixture of disbelief and building tantrum that suggested serious consequences for non-compliance with reasonable requests. Then we'll have to explore other available options, he said, his voice taking on the ominous tone typically reserved for delivering ultimatums. For your own safety and well-being, you understand. The thread hung between us like a bridge none of us particularly wanted to cross, but which seemed to stretch inevitably toward an unpleasant destination where my competence would be evaluated by strangers who knew nothing about my history or capabilities or the specific circumstances that had led to this moment. I sipped my tea and watched steam rise from the cup, thinking about the new keys in my purse and the account passwords I changed that morning and the strange, steady feeling of my own pulse keeping reliable time with the rain that had started outside my windows. Peace is the firmest no I own. I appreciate your concern, I said finally, setting down my cup with deliberate care that made the small porcelain sound ring clear in the tense silence. But I won't be signing any new power of attorney documents. The existing arrangement has been properly revoked, and I intend for it to remain that way. Sarah's cheeks flushed the particular shade of red that appears when reasonable people encounter what they perceive as unreasonable resistance to obviously sensible proposals designed for everyone's benefit. "This is exactly what we're talking about," she said, her voice rising despite her apparent efforts to maintain professional composure. "This paranoid, hostile behavior toward people who are genuinely trying to help and protect you from making mistakes you might regret later." "I'm not hostile," I replied, and meant it completely. The observation felt important, worth stating clearly for the record. "I'm simply no longer available for management." Chapter 7, Envelope with my father's handwriting. They gathered their papers and departed 20 minutes later, after Sarah had shuffled her documents back into the manila folder with sharp, angry movements that suggested filing systems disrupted by uncooperative clients, and my son had made several phone calls to people whose opinions apparently carried more weight than mine in matters concerning my own life and decision-making capacity. Their car tires spun slightly in my wet driveway as they pulled away, and I watched from my kitchen window as they disappeared into the gray afternoon, taking their expectations and management strategies and ultimatums with them toward whatever consultation they would seek next. The house settled around me like a familiar coat, comfortable and protective and entirely my own. I refilled my teacup and sat down to sort through the mail I'd retrieved that morning, but hadn't had time to review before the unexpected visit and its accompanying demands for immediate decisions about my future autonomy. Bills in my name that I would now pay myself, without oversight or approval from family members who might have opinions about my spending priorities. Advertisements for services I didn't need, catalogs featuring products designed for people my age who were apparently expected to have different interests and capabilities than younger consumers. And one envelope that made my breath catch in my throat with recognition and possibility. The return address belonged to Morrison & Associates, the law firm that had handled my father's estate 15 years earlier, when the world still made sense and my competence was assumed rather than evaluated by committees of concerned relatives. The envelope was thin and formal, with my name written in handwriting I recognized despite the passage of time and the fading of so many other memories from that difficult period. Inside, a brief cover letter from the current Mr. Morrison explained that they'd been cleaning out old files during their office renovation and had discovered a letter my father had left with specific instructions to forward to me when she might need to remember what I taught her about standing up straight when other people expect her to bow. My father's letter was written on his old business stationery. The letterhead slightly faded, but his handwriting still bold and certain across the cream-colored page that had somehow survived 15 years of storage in someone else's filing system. My dearest daughter. If you're reading this, then something has happened to make you question whether you have the fundamental right to occupy your own life fully and without apology or justification to people who think they know better than you do about what you need. Someone has probably suggested that your choices are questionable, that your judgment requires supervision, that you need management more than you need respect. Someone has probably told you that their concern for your welfare justifies their control over your decisions. Let me remind you of something you knew absolutely when you were 7 years old and refused to apologize for reading past bedtime with a flashlight under your covers because the story was too good to stop, and sleep seemed like a waste of time that could be better spent discovering what happened next. Personal integrity is not about keeping peace with people who mistake your kindness for weakness or your cooperation for incompetence. It's about keeping peace with yourself when you refuse to betray what you know to be true about your own capabilities and worth. You were never meant to make yourself smaller so others could feel more comfortable with their own limitations. You were never meant to ask permission to exist fully in your own life or to apologize for taking up the space you were born to occupy. Repair what can be honestly mended with people who deserve your effort, but never sacrifice your dignity for other people's comfort or convenience. Some relationships require distance before they can discover genuine respect, and some people need to experience the consequences of taking you for granted before they can appreciate what they've been given. I raised you to be strong enough to stand alone when standing together means standing for less than you deserve. With all my love and absolute faith in your judgment. Dad. There's money I set aside that only you know about, money that belongs entirely to you, with no strings attached and no family obligations or expectations connected to it. The account number is written in the margin of your copy of Gift from the Sea. Use it to buy yourself time and space if you need to remember who you are when you're not being managed by other people. I read the letter 3 times, each word settling into the spaces in my heart where doubt had been living rent-free for too long. My father's voice came through clearly in every sentence, reminding me of conversations we'd had about independence and self-respect and the difference between being loved and being controlled. Then I walked to my bookshelf and pulled out the worn copy of Mauro Lindbergh's Meditation on Solitude and Simplicity, the book I'd read every few years when I needed to remember that being alone could be a gift rather than a punishment, that solitude could be chosen rather than imposed. There, in my father's careful numbers written in pencil along the margin of the chapter about Argonauta, was an account number I'd forgotten existed. A savings account he'd opened when I was first married, for when you need to remember that you always have choices, even when other people forget to offer them to you. Inheritance is not money, it's permission. Chapter 8, Booking the Unknown. The next morning, I sat at my computer with my father's letter beside me and my tea growing cold as I learned about airline booking systems and credit card payments and the small, revolutionary act of purchasing travel in my own name without consultation, approval, or input from anyone else about whether my destination was appropriate or my timing was convenient for other people's schedules. The computer screen glowed with possibilities. Coastal cities where I could walk on beaches and collect shells and watch sunsets without having to explain to anyone why I wanted to feel sand between my toes or what therapeutic value I might derive from observing the eternal rhythm of waves. Mountain towns where I could sit on hotel balconies with morning coffee and afternoon tea and evening wine if I felt like it, watching the light change on peaks that had been standing long before human families developed opinions about appropriate activities for elderly relatives. Museums and cities I'd always wanted to visit, art galleries and historical sites, and cultural centers where I could spend entire afternoons studying paintings and artifacts and ideas that spoke to parts of me that had been sleeping under the weight of other people's management strategies and practical considerations. The destination hardly mattered as much as the act of choosing it myself. What mattered was the soft click of the mouse when I selected purchase, the quiet mechanical sound of my printer awakening to produce something I had chosen entirely for myself, something that represented my own priorities and interests rather than compromises designed to accommodate other people's schedules and preferences. A ticket to anywhere that wasn't here, paid for with money that belonged only to me, scheduled for dates that didn't require anyone else's calendar coordination or permission or approval from family members who might have opinions about whether my travel plans were sensible or necessary. The booking confirmation appeared on my screen with satisfying finality, Eleanor Harrison. 1 passenger. Window seat. Departure date, October 20th. Return, open. My name was spelled correctly and completely, my preferences honored, my autonomy reduced to simple transaction data that nevertheless felt like a profound victory over 3 years of having other people make decisions about where I could go and when I could go there. Click. The smallest sound of a life reopening. I had spent 3 years asking permission to breathe freely in my own house, 3 years having my grocery lists reviewed and my destinations questioned and my basic competence evaluated by people who measured love in terms of control exercised rather than trust offered. But as my printer hummed and my boarding pass emerged with my name and my choices clearly printed in black ink on white paper, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest, a loosening, like a knot that had finally remembered its original purpose was to secure things, not to strangle them. The marigold tea I brewed that afternoon tasted different somehow. Brighter, more complex, seasoned with possibility rather than resignation. I sat at my kitchen table with my new ticket and my father's letter and the strange, unfamiliar sensation of my own authority settling back into my bones where it had always belonged. The afternoon light slanted through my windows at an angle that illuminated everything differently, the same furniture and photographs and keepsakes that had been there yesterday, but somehow transformed by the simple fact that they now belonged to someone who was no longer available for supervision or management by people who had confused care with control. Chapter 9, Platform 9, Not Fantasy, Reality. The suitcase I pulled from my bedroom closet that evening had traveled with me through decades of family vacations and business trips and carefully planned adventures that always seemed to require other people's schedules and preferences more than my own desires or interests. Now it lay open on my bed like a question waiting for an answer, and for the first time in years, I was the only person authorized to provide that answer. I packed slowly, deliberately, with the attention of someone curating rather than simply filling space with items other people thought I might need. The blue cardigan that made me feel capable and dignified, its wool soft with age but still maintaining the shape that had always made me stand a little straighter when I wore it. The comfortable shoes that had carried me through difficult conversations and necessary errands without betraying my confidence or making me feel apologetic about taking up space in the world. The small leather notebook where I'd been writing questions and discoveries, and the gradual map of my own reclaimed territory, financial independence, physical security, decision-making authority, and the particular satisfaction that comes from choosing your own adventures instead of accepting whatever adventures other people think are appropriate for someone your age and circumstances. Train travel, I had decided, offered the sort of dignity that airports seemed determined to strip away through security theater and boarding procedures designed to make passengers feel grateful for basic courtesy and efficient processing through systems that treated human beings like potential problems requiring management and supervision. No lines where strangers examined the contents of your purse as if searching for evidence of poor judgment or dangerous intentions. No gate agents spoke to elderly passengers as if they might not understand fundamental concepts like departure times, seat assignments, and the basic mechanics of following directions. Just a platform, a ticket, and the steady rhythm of wheels on rails carrying you toward wherever you'd decided to go, without anyone else's input about whether your destination was sensible or your timing was convenient. Platform 9 at Union Station bustled with the quiet energy of people who had destinations and the competence to reach them independently. I stood with my small suitcase and my ticket to the coast, watching other travelers of all ages navigate their journeys with the sort of casual confidence I was still in the process of reclaiming for myself after years of having my navigation skills questioned and supervised. An elderly man in a veteran's cap moved steadily toward his departure gate, his dignity intact despite requiring a walking cane for stability. A young mother managed her toddler and her luggage with practiced efficiency, checking her boarding pass one final time before heading toward her platform. Teenagers clustered around charging stations, their easy confidence in navigating complex transportation systems serving as a reminder of what it felt like to assume your own competence rather than having it constantly evaluated by other people. The train arrived precisely on schedule, and I found my window seat as the city began to slide past in a gentle blur of buildings and bridges and the promise of distance from familiar complications and the people who generated them. Somewhere behind me, my son was probably discovering that his key still wouldn't fit my locks. Sarah was likely planning her next intervention strategy, perhaps consulting the internet about legal options for concerned family members who felt their elderly relatives were making poor decisions. But here, with my purse containing keys that belonged only to me and accounts that required only my signature for access, I felt the peculiar lightness of traveling under my own name toward a destination I'd chosen without seeking anyone's approval, input, or opinions about whether my travel plans reflected sound judgment or dangerous independence. The conductor checking tickets moved through the car with professional courtesy, smiling when he saw my coastal destination printed clearly on the pass I handed him. "First time visiting the shore, ma'am?" "First time in a very long time," I corrected, and realized the truth extended far beyond simple geography into territories of autonomy and self-determination that I'd forgotten I was allowed to explore. As the train settled into its traveling rhythm, I pulled out my notebook and my father's fountain pen and began composing the sort of letter I'd been meaning to write for months. Not an explanation or an apology, but a simple statement of new boundaries and changed circumstances that required no justification beyond my own decision to implement them. To whom it may concern. Effective immediately, I will be managing my own financial affairs, travel arrangements, social calendar, household decisions, and personal relationships. I will not be available for supervision, oversight, management, or competency evaluations by family members who have confused control with care or who have mistaken my previous cooperation for incompetence. I am not angry, resentful, or confused about these changes. I am simply no longer available for diminishment or treatment as an incompetent person requiring constant guidance and protection from the natural consequences of my own decisions. Future communications should be addressed to someone who is fully present and engaged in her own life, making her own choices, and taking responsibility for her own outcomes without requiring approval or permission from people who may have opinions about her decisions. Respectfully, Eleanor Harrison. The train carried me through afternoon light and into early evening, past farmland where cows grazed without supervision and small towns where people managed their own affairs without committees of concerned relatives evaluating their decision-making capacity. Eventually, we moved toward the salt-tinged air that meant ocean and space and the sort of endless horizon that puts human complications into proper perspective. When I finally disembarked at the coastal station, the setting sun was painting everything gold and infinitely possible. The air smelled like salt and seaweed, and the particular freedom that comes from being in a place where no one knows your history or has opinions about your capabilities or expects you to justify your presence. I travel light, even with my name intact. Chapter 10, Tea for One, Ticket for Two. I had reserved a small room at a bed and breakfast overlooking the water, the sort of place where breakfast comes with gentle conversation if you want it and respectful solitude if you prefer your own company. The proprietor, a woman perhaps 10 years younger than me, checked me in with the efficient courtesy of someone who understood that guests came to her establishment for privacy and peace rather than entertainment or social obligations. My room featured a porch that faced west, toward sunsets, and the vast democracy of open water that belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. The furniture was simple but comfortable, a chair positioned perfectly for watching the light change on the water, a small table where I could sit with tea or coffee or wine and write in my notebook without anyone asking what I was writing or whether my thoughts were appropriate for someone my age. That first evening, I sat on the weathered porch with a cup of chamomile tea and my father's letter and the sound of waves providing a soundtrack for thoughts I'd been afraid to think clearly for too long. The ocean stretched beyond my sight, indifferent to human expectations and entirely itself, offering the sort of perspective that comes only from observing something genuinely larger than personal complications and family politics. The waves followed no schedule but their own ancient rhythm, arriving and retreating according to forces that had been operating long before human beings developed opinions about appropriate behavior for elderly relatives. I found this comforting in a way I hadn't expected, the reminder that most of the universe operated perfectly well without supervision or management or committees of concerned parties evaluating its decision-making capacity. The next morning arrived soft and gray, with fog lifting slowly from the water and the promise of clarity somewhere in the middle distance between sleep and full awakening. I walked the beach barefoot, letting the waves chase and retreat around my ankles while I practiced the strange sensation of moving through space without destination, schedule, or anyone's approval except my own. Other people walked the beach as well, couples holding hands, families with children building sand castles, elderly people like myself who had apparently decided that beach walking was an appropriate activity regardless of what their adult children might think about sand between their toes and salt air in their hair. Later, sitting on my porch with coffee and my notebook, I wrote the final updates to my will. Nothing dramatic or vindictive, simply a document that reflected my current understanding of which relationships had earned trust over time and which had confused entitlement with genuine affection. The changes were simple but significant: charitable donations to organizations that supported elderly independence, specific bequests to friends who had treated me with consistent respect, and careful provisions that would prevent my assets from being used to reward people who had treated my autonomy as a problem requiring their management. The local attorney I consulted proved both competent and kind, asking only the questions necessary to ensure my wishes were legally sound and clearly stated without offering unwanted advice about family dynamics or emotional implications. Her office overlooked the harbor, and she spoke to me with the same professional courtesy she would have offered any client, regardless of age or family circumstances. "These are thoughtful arrangements," she said, reviewing my draft documents. "Clear intentions, practical provisions, and appropriate protections for your autonomy. Is there anything else you'd like to include?" "Yes," I said, thinking about my father's letter and the account he'd hidden in the margins of my favorite book. "I'd like to establish a small fund for other people who might need to remember they have choices. Something that could help cover legal fees, temporary housing, or other practical expenses for people whose families have confused care with control." she made notes about establishing the fund and the criteria for accessing it. An excellent idea. Independence isn't free, unfortunately. Sometimes people need financial resources to exercise their legal rights. On my last morning at the coast, I sat on the porch with tea for one and imagined my father in the empty chair beside me, watching the sun break through the coastal fog with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully taught his daughter to stand firmly in her own convictions when it mattered most. The notebook entry I wrote that morning deliberately echoed the scene that had started this quiet revolution, but now the words carried the weight of lived experience rather than hypothetical possibility. We don't need you at the airport. We don't need you to manage our dignity or evaluate our decisions. We don't need permission to exist fully in our own lives or approval to make choices that reflect our own priorities rather than other people's convenience. Some arrivals require no airport announcement, only the willingness to recognize when you've finally come home to yourself. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility as I wrote, each word settling onto the page with the deliberate care of someone who had learned the difference between writing for other people's approval and writing for the simple satisfaction of recording truth as she understood it. A seagull landed on the porch railing, studied me with the frank curiosity of a creature that had never asked permission to exist in its own space, then flew away toward whatever destination called to it. I envied that certainty, that assumption of belonging wherever you happened to be. The train ride back felt different somehow, not a retreat but a return with reinforcements. New understanding packed in my suitcase along with sea glass I'd collected and the particular quality of peace that comes from discovering you're perfectly capable of your own company and quite content with the conversation it provides. The countryside slid past my window with the same gentle rhythm that had carried me away. But now I saw it through eyes that had remembered how to see from my own perspective rather than through the lens of other people's expectations about what should interest someone my age. My house welcomed me back with the specific silence of a space that had remembered how to belong completely to its owner. The new locks turned smoothly under my keys, and I noticed details I'd forgotten to appreciate, the way afternoon light fell across my kitchen table, the particular comfort of chairs that had been chosen for my body and my preferences. The satisfaction of opening mail that belonged entirely to me. The marigold plants on my kitchen windowsill had not only survived my absence but seemed to have flourished, their orange blooms brighter and more abundant than when I'd left. I took this as a good omen, though I'd grown beyond needing omens to justify my decisions. The messages accumulating on my phone could wait for my convenience. The letters stacked in my mailbox would be answered according to my own schedule and priorities. Tonight, I would brew tea and sit at my kitchen table and listen to the sound of my own life humming quietly along its chosen path without requiring supervision, management, or anyone's permission beyond my own. Among the accumulated mail, I found exactly what I'd expected, formal letters from my son's attorney about competency evaluations and protective services, official-looking documents designed to intimidate me into compliance with other people's ideas about appropriate behavior for someone my age and circumstances. I read them with the detached interest of someone reviewing historical documents about conflicts that no longer concerned her. The threats seemed smaller now, less capable of generating the anxiety and self-doubt they would have produced just weeks earlier. I filed them in a folder labeled Other People's Problems and moved on to mail that actually required my attention. A letter from Mrs. Chen at the bank confirmed that all power of attorney arrangements had been successfully revoked and my accounts were now under my exclusive control. A statement showed the balance in my father's hidden account, enough to fund several more coastal retreats or whatever other adventures might call to me in the months ahead. That evening, as I prepared dinner for one in my own kitchen, I reflected on the strange mathematics of independence. 3 years of asking permission had been replaced by a single week of taking action. Months of feeling diminished had been transformed by a few simple decisions, changed locks, revoked authorizations, purchased tickets, and established boundaries. The pot roast I cooked that night was seasoned exactly the way I preferred, with herbs from my own garden and wine I'd chosen because I liked the label rather than because someone else approved of my selection. I ate at my own pace, in my own time, while reading a book I'd borrowed from the library during my downtown adventure. A biography of a woman who had traveled alone across 3 continents in the 1920s, when such behavior was considered scandalous rather than simply independent. Later, as I prepared for bed in my own room in my own house secured by locks that responded only to my keys, I thought about the strange reversal that had occurred. For 3 years, I'd been treated as if I were aging backward toward incompetence and dependence. Now, at 72, I felt as if I were finally growing up into the person I'd always been meant to become. The next few weeks established a new rhythm that belonged entirely to me. Morning coffee on my porch while reading newspapers I'd chosen because their perspectives interested me, rather than because someone else thought they were appropriate for my supposed political views. Afternoon walks to the library, where I researched genealogy and local history and occasionally helped other visitors navigate the computer systems that younger people assumed would be challenging for someone my age. Evening phone calls with friends I neglected during the years when my social calendar required approval from people who might have opinions about whether my friendships were appropriate or whether my activities took too much time away from family obligations. I discovered that several of my contemporaries had been navigating similar challenges with adult children who had gradually assumed authority over decisions that rightfully belonged to their parents. We formed an informal support network, sharing information about legal rights and practical strategies for maintaining independence in families where good intentions had evolved into controlling behavior. One afternoon, Margaret from my book club mentioned that her daughter had been surprised to learn that opening someone else's mail without permission was actually a federal crime, regardless of family relationships or concerns about cognitive capacity. Funny how quickly they develop respect for your privacy when they understand the legal implications, she observed with satisfaction. Another friend, Dorothy, had discovered that many banks offered special protections for elderly customers, including waiting periods for power of attorney changes and fraud prevention services that could help prevent financial abuse by family members. I thought I was being paranoid, she said, but the bank representative assured me that family financial abuse is more common than most people realize. These conversations reminded me that my experience wasn't unique or pathological, but part of a larger pattern where adult children sometimes confused their parents' kindness and cooperation with incompetence requiring management. The problem wasn't my age or cognitive capacity, but a family dynamic that had gradually shifted from mutual respect to unilateral control. My son made several attempts to restore the previous arrangement, each approach more sophisticated than the last. First came emotional appeals about family unity and his concerns for my safety. Then, professional consultations with elder care specialists who could supposedly help me understand the benefits of supervised independence. Finally, legal letters suggested that my behavior constituted evidence of diminished capacity requiring intervention. Each approach was met with the same response, polite but firm refusal to engage with any process that required me to justify my competence to people who had benefited from assuming I didn't possess it. I had learned that the most effective response to manipulation is often simple non-participation. The holidays arrived with their traditional demands for family gatherings and complicated negotiations about who would host what events and which traditions would be maintained despite changed circumstances. For the first time in years, I found myself able to make decisions based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations about appropriate behavior for family members who were supposed to prioritize harmony over personal boundaries. I sent polite responses to invitations that didn't interest me and enthusiastic acceptances to those that did. I hosted a small dinner for friends who treated me with consistent respect and declined to attend gatherings where my presence seemed to be expected rather than wanted. I discovered that many social obligations I'd considered mandatory were actually optional, and that saying no to events that didn't bring me joy left more time and energy for activities that did. Christmas morning found me sitting by my own fireplace with coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls, reading a mystery novel, and feeling perfectly content with my own company. The silence wasn't lonely but peaceful, filled with the satisfaction of a life arranged according to my own priorities rather than other people's expectations about how elderly relatives should spend holidays. Later that day, I called friends who were also spending the holiday according to their own preferences rather than family obligations. We shared stories about grandchildren and travel plans and books we'd enjoyed, conversations that flowed naturally because they were based on mutual interest rather than duty or obligation. Spring brought new possibilities and the satisfaction of a life that had found its natural rhythm. My garden flourished under my own care, producing vegetables I actually wanted to eat and flowers I chose because they pleased me rather than because someone else thought they were appropriate for someone my age. The marigolds returned with particular abundance, their bright orange blooms serving as daily reminders of my own capacity for renewal and growth. The coastal bed and breakfast sent a newsletter about their upcoming season, and I found myself planning another retreat without consulting anyone about whether the timing was convenient or the expense was justified. The simple act of looking forward to my own adventure felt revolutionary after years of having my future managed by people who seemed to believe I couldn't be trusted with my own calendar. My father's fund for elderly independence had begun helping other people navigate similar transitions, providing small grants for legal fees, temporary housing, and other practical expenses that could make the difference between theoretical rights and actual freedom. The attorney who administered the fund reported that demand was higher than expected, confirming my suspicion that family financial control was more common than most people realized. One afternoon, while tending my garden, I heard familiar voices in my driveway. My son and Sarah had returned, but this time they approached my front door with the careful courtesy of people who understood they were visiting rather than inspecting. Their body language suggested a different kind of conversation than the interventions and ultimatums that had characterized our previous interactions. "Mom," my son said when I answered the door, "we were wondering if we could talk with you. We've been doing some thinking about the past few months." I invited them in, noting how they waited for permission to sit and asked politely before helping themselves to the tea I offered. The manila folders and legal documents were notably absent from this visit. "We owe you an apology," Sarah said, her voice carrying none of the patronizing patience that had characterized our earlier conversations. "We realize we overstepped some boundaries, and we'd like to discuss how we can have a better relationship going forward." The conversation that followed was careful but genuine, focused on acknowledging mistakes rather than defending previous behavior. They had apparently consulted a family counselor who specialized in intergenerational relationships and had helped them understand the difference between supportive concern and controlling behavior. "We thought we were helping," my son explained, "but we realized we were actually making you feel like we didn't trust your judgment. That wasn't our intention, but it was the result of our actions." I listened with the detached interest of someone evaluating a business proposal rather than the emotional investment of someone whose self-worth depended on family approval. The apology seemed sincere, but I had learned to judge people by their sustained behavior rather than their temporary words. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied carefully. "I'm willing to work toward a better relationship, but it will need to be based on respect for my autonomy rather than concern for my well-being." Those aren't the same thing. We established new boundaries that respected my independence while acknowledging their desire to maintain some family connection. Regular but not intrusive contact. Invitations rather than expectations for family gatherings. Requests rather than assumptions about assistance with household projects or transportation needs. Most importantly, we agreed that my financial affairs, medical decisions, and living arrangements were my responsibility unless I specifically requested their input or assistance. They would no longer have access to my accounts or keys to my home, but they would be welcome guests when they treated me as the competent adult I had always been. The relationship that emerged from this negotiation was smaller but more honest than what had existed before. We saw each other less frequently but enjoyed each other's company more when we did spend time together. Lily, my granddaughter, seemed to benefit from observing a family dynamic based on mutual respect rather than authority and compliance. Summer brought my second coastal retreat, this time planned with the confidence of someone who had completed one independent adventure and was ready for another. The same bed and breakfast welcomed me back, and I spent a week walking beaches, reading books, and writing in my journal without feeling obligated to justify my activities to anyone except myself. On my last evening of that second retreat, I sat on the familiar porch with tea for one and watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange that reminded me of my marigolds. The chair beside me remained empty, but I no longer felt the need to imagine my father's presence to validate my choices. His letter had served its purpose, reminding me of lessons I'd temporarily forgotten, but now I could carry that wisdom within myself. The notebook entry I wrote that evening reflected not triumph over my family, but satisfaction with my own growth. Independence is not about rejecting relationships, but about choosing them from a position of strength rather than accepting them from a position of need. Some people are capable of loving you while respecting your autonomy. Others are only capable of loving you while controlling your choices. The difference becomes clear when you stop accepting the second type as an inevitable consequence of family obligation. Dignity makes no scene, it simply stands still until the storm passes and then continues moving in the direction it was always meant to go. The train ride home felt like returning to a life I had consciously chosen rather than one that had been arranged for me by other people's ideas about what I needed or deserved. My house stood exactly as I had left it, secure behind locks that remembered only what I told them to remember, filled with possessions I had chosen and arranged according to my own preferences. That evening, as I prepared dinner in my own kitchen and planned the next day according to my own priorities, I reflected on the mathematics of transformation. A single moment of clarity at an airport had led to a series of small actions that had completely restructured my life within a matter of weeks. The woman who had stood trembling with a boarding pass printed by someone else had evolved into someone who traveled when and where she chose, lived according to her own schedule, and measured her worth by her own standards rather than other people's approval. The marigolds in my garden had reached full bloom, their bright faces turned toward the sun with the confidence of plants that knew they belonged exactly where they were growing. I took this as a metaphor for my own situation, not because I needed omens to validate my choices, but because the natural world offered such clear examples of how to exist fully without apology. As autumn returned and I prepared for my first winter of complete independence, I found myself planning not just for the season ahead but for the years that would follow. Travel to places I had always wanted to see. Projects I had always wanted to pursue. Relationships I wanted to deepen with people who treated me with consistent respect and kindness. The coastal bed and breakfast had offered me a special rate for winter visits, recognizing me as a returning guest whose presence added to the peaceful atmosphere they cultivated for travelers seeking restoration rather than entertainment. I had already reserved a week in January, when the storms would be most dramatic and the solitude most complete. My father's fund continued to help other elderly people reclaim their independence, and I had begun volunteering with an organization that provided legal advocacy for seniors experiencing family financial abuse. The work was satisfying in ways I hadn't expected, offering me the chance to use my experience to help others navigate similar transitions. Some of the people I worked with were dealing with situations far more extreme than mine had been, adult children who had assumed complete control over their parents' finances and living arrangements, sometimes with devastating consequences for people who had lost not just their autonomy but their basic dignity. My situation, I realized, had been relatively mild but had served as an important warning about how quickly respect could erode when it wasn't actively maintained. A year after my non-departure from the airport, I found myself standing at the same gate where everything had changed. This time, I held a boarding pass I had printed myself, for a destination I had chosen, paid for with money that belonged entirely to me. The difference was profound, not just in the practical circumstances, but in the quality of attention I brought to the moment. The same terminal bustled with the same choreography of goodbyes and hellos, but now I watched as an observer rather than a participant in other people's dramas. I had learned to distinguish between connection and control, between love and management, between family and obligation. My flight was called, and I joined the line of passengers moving toward their gate with the easy confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were going. As I handed my boarding pass to the gate agent, my boarding pass, printed by my hands, representing my choices, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived on its own terms. The plane carried me toward new adventures I had planned in the quiet hours of early morning, over coffee that stayed warm because no one was rushing me to finish and move on to more important activities. Below, the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, offering the same lesson the ocean had taught me, that dignity was not something granted by others but something claimed and maintained by individuals who understood their own worth. As we climbed toward cruising altitude, I opened my notebook and wrote a final entry about the journey that had brought me from that earlier moment of trembling uncertainty to this moment of chosen adventure. *A year ago, I stood in this same terminal holding someone else's idea of my future. Today, I carry my own. The difference is measured not in miles traveled but in the quality of permission I grant myself to exist fully in my own life. Some departures are arrivals in disguise. Some standing still is the beginning of movement. Some silence is the loudest declaration of independence. Dignity makes no scene, it simply boards the plane and flies toward whatever horizon calls to it. Outside my window, clouds formed and reformed in patterns that followed no human schedule, reminding me that most of the world operated according to its own ancient wisdom rather than other people's opinions about appropriate behavior. I settled back in my seat, window, just as I had requested, and watched the earth fall away beneath me, carrying me toward whatever adventures awaited someone who had finally learned to travel under her own name, in her own time, toward destinations of her own choosing. The flight attendant offered me tea, and I accepted with the simple pleasure of someone who no longer needed to justify her preferences to anyone except herself. The cup warmed my hands as we flew through clouds toward a future I had designed according to my own specifications, funded by my own resources, scheduled according to my own calendar. Below, other people lived their lives in whatever arrangements they had chosen or accepted, and I wished them well while feeling no obligation to participate in dynamics that required me to diminish myself for other people's comfort. Some relationships, I had learned, were worth the effort required to repair them. Others were worth the courage required to release them. The plane flew on through afternoon light toward evening and the promise of new places where I could walk and think and write without explaining my activities to anyone except myself. Behind me, my house stood secure behind locks that remembered only what I told them to remember, my garden grew according to its own seasons, and my life continued along the path I had consciously chosen rather than the one that had been arranged for me by other people's ideas about what I needed or deserved. If this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who needs it.